In most modern editions of Pippi Longstocking, when Pippi talks about her absent father, Captain Ephraim Longstocking, she describes him with a grand fairy tale title. He is, she says, the king of a faraway island in the South Seas, beloved by his subjects. The Swedish term used is Söderhavskung, which translates directly to South Seas King. It's a title that fits perfectly within the whimsical, anti-authoritarian logic of Pippi's world, a world where a 9-year-old girl can live alone with a horse and a monkey, funded by a suitcase of gold coins. The image it conjures is one of a benign, eccentric ruler in an exotic, sunny paradise. This is the version that has settled into our collective memory. But in the first edition, published in Sweden in 1945, Pippi does not call her father a South Seas king. She uses a different 2-word title. The second word is kung, meaning king. The first word is the N-word. This fact sits like a piece of grit in the machinery of a beloved childhood classic. It is not an interpretation, nor a contested reading. It is a textual fact. For decades, Pippi Longstocking's father was explicitly and textually referred to as a king using the N-word. This term, and the entire colonial fantasy it represents, was not incidental. It was a core part of Pippi's identity, the source of her wealth, her status, and her unshakable confidence. The subsequent removal of this term and its replacement with South Seas King has been the subject of intense debate, particularly in Sweden and Germany, where it is often framed as an act of censorship, a retroactive application of modern sensibilities onto a historical text. But to focus only on the single word change is to miss the point entirely. The change was not a simple redaction, it was a procedure that left the original anatomy of the story's power structure almost entirely intact, but rendered its origins invisible. To understand what was done, we have to place the two versions side by side. We conduct a parallel autopsy. On one table lies the familiar sanitized version, on the other, the original 1945 text by Astrid Lindgren, with the original illustrations by Ingrid Wang Neumann. By comparing them, point by point, we are not trying to answer the simple question of whether the book was racist. The answer to that is self-evident. We are asking a more complicated set of questions. What specific colonial fantasy was being enacted in the original? How did that fantasy fuel the story we love? And what was actually achieved by changing a few words while leaving the rest of the skeleton in place? Let's begin by establishing the baseline, the version on the first table. This is the Pippi Longstocking that has been translated and distributed globally for the last few decades. Pippi is the ultimate symbol of childhood freedom. She is superhumanly strong, fantastically wealthy, and lives without adult supervision. She challenges every form of arbitrary authority: officious police officers, clueless teachers, condescending adults. Her father, Captain Ephraim, is a remote but benevolent figure. He is a sea captain who was blown overboard in a storm and washed ashore on Kurrakurradutt Island, where the inhabitants, charmed by him, made him their king. In this telling, his kingship is a whimsical accident, a quirky backstory that explains Pippi's gold and her connection to a world of adventure. The people of the island are her father's subjects, a vague and generic term. They are presented as simple, happy people who love their unconventional king. Pippi plans to one day join him and become a princess. The entire arrangement is framed as a charming, harmless fantasy. The power dynamic is that of a fairy tale, not of history. This is our control specimen. It is polished, smooth, and culturally acceptable. Now, we turn to the second table. Here we have the first edition from 1945. The book itself, as an object, feels different. The paper, the typeface, the texture of Ingrid Wang Neumann's illustrations, and the text is starkly different from the very first mention of Captain Longstocking, when Pippi explains her father's whereabouts to her new friends, Tommy and Annika. She doesn't just say he is a king. She says, and this is a direct translation from the 1945 Swedish original, he is the N-word king. It's not everyone who has a father like that. She then adds, my papa is a cannonball and he is the terror of the seas. The Swedish for that is havens skräck. This is not a benign ruler. This is a pirate, a figure of fear who has established dominance. The title N-word kung is not presented as a neutral descriptor. It is a boast. It is the foundation of her father's, and by extension, her own extraordinary status. It is meant to impress Tommy and Annika with its exotic power, and it does. This is our first major point of divergence, the shift from N-word kung to Söderhavskung. To a modern English-speaking audience, the toxicity of the first term is immediate. In the context of the Swedish debate, however, defenders of the original text have sometimes argued that the N-word did not carry the same violent weight in 1940s Sweden as its English counterpart did in America. The scholar Eske Wallin, in her analysis of the Pippi translations, has documented how the term was common in Swedish popular culture of the time, often used in adventure stories and travelogues to denote exotic, primitive peoples. But this argument for neutrality is a distraction. The word's function in the text is not neutral, it is hierarchical. It is used to define a group of people over whom a white European man can, by virtue of his presumed superiority, become king. The term itself establishes the power relationship. The word Söderhavskung, or South Seas King, performs a clever laundering of this dynamic. It retains the exoticism, the South Seas, but replaces the racial hierarchy with a seemingly neutral geographical and political title. King implies a political structure, one that could, in theory, be legitimate. N-word kung, by contrast, implies a racial structure. The revision removes the explicit racial category, but it leaves the fundamental premise untouched. A white man washed ashore is naturally and immediately elevated to a position of absolute power over a non-white population. The change in terminology obscures the colonial logic without dismantling it. The second point of divergence follows directly from the first, the depiction of the island's inhabitants. In the modern, revised text, they are subjects, or the islanders. In the 1945 original, Pippi is much more specific. Describing life on the island of Kurrekurreduttön, she tells Tommy and Annika, there are no end of children on that island, and all of them have a N-word for a mother, and a N-word for a father, and they play with me all day long. The children are defined solely by their race, and in a way that positions them as playthings or background characters for Pippi's adventure. They are not individuals, they are a racial collective. This is where Ingrid Wang Neumann's original illustrations become critical evidence. When we see the children of Kurrekurreduttön, they are drawn as Pickaninny caricatures. They have jet black skin, enormous white eyes, and grass skirts. They are depicted as generic, interchangeable savages, a visual vocabulary lifted directly from colonial-era cartoons and adventure fiction. One famous illustration shows Pippi's father, a large, benevolent-looking white man, being carried on a throne by several black men. In another, Pippi is shown playing with the island children, who are all smaller than her, looking up at her with adoration. The visual narrative reinforces the textual one. The people of Kurrekurreduttön exist to serve and admire their white rulers. When the text was revised to remove the racial slurs, the illustrations were often left unchanged for many years. This created a jarring disconnect. The text might now speak of generic islanders, but the pictures still showed racist caricatures. Eventually, in some later editions, the illustrations were altered as well, recolouring the children or softening their features. But the original visual evidence is crucial. because it demolishes any argument that the original text's racial framing was somehow innocent or unintentional. The text and images worked together to create a coherent and deeply colonial fantasy. The people of Kurukuradutan are not just subjects, they are a specific racist trope, the happy, childlike natives who are grateful for the civilizing presence of a white master. They exist without their own history, their own political structures, or their own agency. Their island is a blank space, a playground, waiting for a European to arrive and give it meaning, to become its king. The third and perhaps most unsettling point of comparison concerns the nature of Captain Ephraim's rule and the source of his power. The modern version is vague on this point. He's a king because they made him one. The original is far more explicit about the violent power dynamics of the colonial world. Remember Pippi's boast? Her father is Haven Skrak, the terror of the seas. This is the language of piracy and conquest, not benevolent leadership. Furthermore, the original text directly engages with the trope of cannibalism. In one scene, Pippi tells Tommy and Annika that on Kurukuradutan, if any nasty person comes there, they get eaten up. She frames this as a positive, a form of island security. But it plays directly into one of the oldest and most pernicious justifications for colonialism, the idea that savage peoples are monstrous and need to be controlled. The book wants to have it both ways. The cannibalism is presented as a quirky, amusing detail, yet it simultaneously reinforces the very stereotypes that historically justified colonial violence. It makes the islanders seem dangerous and primitive, which in turn makes Ephraim's rule over them seem necessary and even protective. He is the strong white man who can control the wild natives. This connects directly to Pippi's suitcase of gold. In the sanitized narrative, the gold is simply treasure, the magical bounty of a pirate's life. It's fantasy money with no real-world origin. But viewed through the lens of the 1945 text, the gold takes on a different character. It is the product of a colonial economy. Her father is not just a king, he is the terror of the seas who rules over a cannibal island. This context suggests the gold is not found treasure but plunder. Pippi's economic independence, the very thing that makes her a feminist icon for many readers, is directly funded by the spoils of colonial exploitation. Her rebellion against the minor authorities of her Swedish town, the police, the school, the Child Welfare Board, is underwritten by a much larger global system of racial and economic domination. The story meticulously documents Pippi's defiance of local, domestic power structures, while completely naturalizing the global, colonial power structure that makes her defiance possible. She can mock the Swedish police because her father rules an army of racialized others on the other side of the world. Her freedom is purchased with their subjugation. The original text makes this connection unavoidable. The revised text makes it invisible, transforming the profits of colonialism into magical fairy tale gold. At this point in any analysis of a historical text, a major complication must be introduced. It is easy to judge the past from the standpoint of the present. The complication here is Astrid Lindgren herself. Lindgren was, by all accounts, a committed anti-racist and humanitarian throughout her life. She was an outspoken opponent of Nazism and a passionate advocate for children's rights and animal welfare. How could a person with these values create a character and a world so steeped in the colonial clichés of her time? In the 1970s, when first challenged on the language in Pippi, Lindgren responded with a letter. She wrote, "I didn't know and had no idea that the word N-word was a pejorative word. I was an unenlightened creature who wrote a book for children in which the only thing I wanted to do was entertain the child readers." She admitted her ignorance and expressed regret, stating that if she were writing the book today, she would not have used the term. She even authorized some of the changes herself before her death in 2002. This presents a challenge to a simple condemnation. Lindgren was not a malicious propagandist. She was, as she said, a product of her time, working with a set of cultural tropes that were widely available and largely unquestioned in 1940s Sweden. Adventure stories for children were filled with these images of exotic lands and primitive peoples. Lindgren was drawing from a common well. This does not excuse the content, but it does contextualize it. It shifts the focus from the author's individual moral failing to the pervasive nature of the cultural assumptions she inherited. The problem wasn't just Astrid Lindgren, the problem was the entire imaginative landscape of mid-20th century Europe. The story of Pippi Longstocking becomes the story of how easily these toxic assumptions could be woven into even the most imaginative and liberating children's literature. Lindgren's later regret is significant. It models a capacity for growth and a willingness to listen to criticism, a quality often absent in the more heated defences of her original text. It acknowledges that a work of art is not a sacred, untouchable object, but a living document that exists in a changing world and has real effects on its readers. This brings us to the second, more recent complication, the controversy over the revisions. When Lindgren's heirs formally approved the removal of the racial slurs from new editions of the book in 2015, it ignited a fierce debate in Sweden and other parts of Europe. The move was decried by many as censorship, an attempt to rewrite history to conform to political correctness. Prominent cultural commentators argued that altering an author's original words was a dangerous precedent, a form of cultural vandalism. They argued that the book should be presented as it was written, perhaps with a contextualizing foreword to teach children about the history of racism. The slogan, "Don't touch my Pippi," became a rallying cry. This argument, on the surface, appears to be a principled stand for artistic integrity and historical honesty. It positions the defenders of the original text as champions of free expression and the editors as cowardly censors. But this framing of the debate is profoundly misleading. It creates a false equivalence between preserving a racial slur in a children's book and honestly confronting history. Publishing a book for 6-year-olds is not a form of historical scholarship. It is an act of cultural transmission. The primary function of the Pippi books today is not to serve as a document of 1940s Swedish racial attitudes. Their function is to entertain and inspire children. For a black child reading the book, encountering the term N-word kung is not a lesson in historical context. It is a moment of alienation and hurt. It signals that this world of adventure and freedom is not for them. The argument for historical preservation in this context often serves as a convenient shield for a deeper resistance to acknowledging the harm caused by such language. It prioritizes the abstract principle of the author's original text over the concrete experience of the child reader. Furthermore, it ignores the long history of children's literature being constantly updated and revised. Stories are always being abridged, re-illustrated, and slightly modernized for new audiences. The sudden, fierce defense of this particular text's original wording seems selective. The outrage is not applied universally to all textual changes, but specifically to this one, which involves race. Now, we can finally turn back to our two specimens on the parallel tables and state the central argument that emerges from this comparison. The argument is not that the original is bad and the revision is good. The argument is that the revision process itself created a new and in some ways more insidious problem. This is the thesis of convergent darkness. The original text is a product of a colonial mindset, but it is an honest product. Its racism is explicit. It wears its ideology on its sleeve. The power dynamic is clear. Pippi's father is a terror of the seas who rules over racialized caricatures, and his exploits fund Pippi's life. The book, in its 1945 form, is a perfect artifact of the colonial imagination. It shows exactly how the fantasy of racial domination was laundered into children's entertainment. It is a raw and revealing document. The revised text performs a cosmetic operation. It removes the offensive terminology, the slurs, but it leaves the underlying structure of the fantasy perfectly intact. Captain Ephraim is still a white European who becomes king of a non-white population on a South Seas island. They are still his subjects. He still got there by accident and was simply made their king, a narrative that erases any possibility of conquest or coercion and denies the islanders any political sophistication of their own. Pippi's gold is still the foundation of her freedom, but its colonial origins are now completely obscured. The revision doesn't solve the colonial problem, it hides it. It replaces the darkness of explicit racism with the darkness of invisible ideology. The original book is a window into a racist worldview. The revised book is a wall. It presents the same fundamental power relationship, but pretends it is a harmless fairy tale. In this sense, the sanitized version is arguably more confusing for a young reader. It presents a colonial fantasy as normal, as whimsical, as something to aspire to, without any of the textual red flags that might prompt a critical conversation. It replaces a visible poison with an odorless gas. Consider the effect this has on the character of Pippi herself. In the original, her anarchic spirit is explicitly tied to a system of global domination. She is the daughter of a colonial master, and her behaviour reflects that unshakable sense of entitlement. She is not just a strong girl, she is a strong white girl from the ruling class of the world. Her power is not just personal, it is racial and imperial. The revised text severs this connection. It attempts to purify Pippi, to present her as a purely anti-authoritarian figure, a symbol of generic rebellion. But the source of her power, the gold, the status, remains the same. The revision creates an incoherence at the heart of the story. It asks us to celebrate Pippi's rebellion against minor local authorities while ignoring the massive global authority she represents. The modern Pippi is a character who has been deliberately decontextualized, her freedom laundered, her power given a magical rather than a historical source. The story becomes less honest about the nature of power in the real world. This entire process, from the original creation to the clumsy revision to the heated public debate, offers a powerful case study in how cultures deal with uncomfortable aspects of their past. The initial impulse is often not to excavate and understand, but to patch and conceal. The goal of the Pippi revision was not to dismantle the colonial fantasy at the heart of the story. That would have required a much more radical rewriting, or perhaps retiring the book altogether. The goal was to make the book palatable for a modern audience without fundamentally altering its structure. It was an act of brand management. The result is a text that is arguably less useful. The original, for all its ugliness, is a diagnostic tool. It tells us something true about the culture that produced it. The revision is a compromise that satisfies no one. It fails to truly address the colonial logic for those who are troubled by it, while simultaneously infuriating those who believe no classic text should ever be altered. What this autopsy reveals is that the debate should never have been about a single word. The word was a symptom, not the disease. The disease was the underlying fantasy, the belief that it is the natural right of a European man to rule over non-white peoples, that their lands are playgrounds, and that their resources are there for the taking. This fantasy is the engine of Pippi's story. Changing N-word kung to Hurusudahafskung is like repainting a car that has a broken engine. The problem remains, it's just harder to see. The entire controversy has served to distract from a deeper reading of what the Pippi stories are actually about. The relationship between freedom and power, between rebellion and privilege. Pippi is free because she is powerful, and in the world Lindgren inherited, the ultimate source of power was the colonial enterprise. So where does this leave us? The pattern we have observed here, the sanitization of language that preserves a problematic underlying structure, is not unique to Pippi Longstocking. It is a common strategy in the adaptation and curation of classic literature, film, and other cultural products. We see it when stories of westward expansion in America are retold with the violence against indigenous peoples minimized or romanticized. We see it when historical films focus on the personal dramas of slave owners while treating the enslaved as a passive backdrop. The pattern is always the same: remove the most explicit, undeniable markers of bigotry, the slurs and the overt violence, but leave the core assumptions about who has agency, who is civilized, and whose perspective matters completely untouched. The result is a history that has been declawed, made safe for consumption, but also stripped of its most important lessons. It teaches us to be offended by slurs, but not by systems of power. The case of Pippi Longstocking demonstrates that the most consequential changes to a text are not always the ones that add something new, but the ones that make something old invisible. The debate over whether to use the 1945 text or the modern one is, in the end, a debate over two different kinds of darkness. One is the stark, unambiguous darkness of a historical artifact that reflects the casual racism of its time. The other is the subtle, pervasive darkness of a story that has been modified to hide its own ideological foundations, presenting a colonial power fantasy as a simple, harmless adventure for children. There is no easy answer as to which is preferable, but recognizing the nature of both is the first step toward a more honest engagement with the stories we inherit. The real work is not just in striking out offensive words, but in learning to see the structures those words were once used to build, especially after they have been rendered silent and invisible, holding up the story long after the sounds have faded.